The summer of 1996 carried with it the kind of heat that made roads shimmer like molten gold and skies stretch endlessly, unbroken, above the horizon. It was the perfect season for adventure, for the kind of reckless freedom that only young hearts could feel without hesitation. Two best friends, inseparable since childhood, had packed into a battered sedan, windows rolled down, music blasting through worn speakers, and set out on a road trip they promised each other would be unforgettable. Their names had been whispered in school hallways, laughed over in sleepovers, scribbled in notebooks as inside jokes that no one else could understand. One was bold and untamed, the kind of person who could convince anyone to chase the sunrise with no plan and no fear. The other, careful and introspective, balanced their friend's wild energy with a quiet, steady presence, a safety net of rational thought and unwavering loyalty. Together, they were unstoppable, or at least that's what everyone thought. They had left behind familiar streets, waving goodbye to parents who smiled nervously, hiding the unease that comes when you know life is about to become unpredictable. The townspeople, if they thought of the pair at all, imagined them laughing under the sun somewhere far away, a fleeting adventure that would make them grow, make them tell stories later at family dinners. But as the sedan disappeared down the winding roads, the first threads of uncertainty began to weave themselves quietly into the edges of the story, invisible yet present, like the faint shadow of clouds on the horizon that no one notices until they block the sun. Their journey began with the familiar rhythm of a road trip, gas station stops, vending machine snacks, maps sprawled across the dashboard, and conversations that drifted from childhood memories to wild imaginings of the future. They laughed over inside jokes, argued playfully about which route to take, and paused at overlook points to take pictures of the rolling hills, the glinting lakes, the horizon bending into impossibility. Their joy was tangible, almost infectious, and anyone who glimpsed their carefree presence would have thought they were immortal in that fleeting moment. Yet, for those who look closer, there are always subtle signs, moments that seem ordinary at the time but become haunting in retrospect. The way one friend had paused, glancing into the trees at the side of the road, as if sensing something unseen. Or the brief hesitation at a turn-off no one else seemed to notice. By nightfall, the two friends had found themselves under a sky punctured with stars, the kind of vastness that makes a person feel both insignificant and infinite at once. They pitched a small tent near a quiet riverbank, the water reflecting the moon like fractured glass. Their laughter carried across the clearing, mingling with the chirping of crickets and the gentle rush of the current. They snapped photographs with a small disposable camera, each click capturing the pure essence of youth and friendship. They didn't know then that those photographs would one day be the last tangible proof of their existence, frozen moments that the world would desperately cling to. The night was calm, almost deceptively so, and they talked about dreams that stretched far beyond the horizon they had just crossed. Plans for college, imagined careers, romantic ideals. They whispered them to the stars, believing that the world was a vast playground, endless and forgiving. Yet beneath that laughter and the warmth of the firelight, there was a subtle undercurrent of unease, like the faint tremor of a far-off storm. It was imperceptible, almost invisible, but in storytelling, it is often these smallest details, the slight glance over the shoulder, the hesitation in speech, the fleeting discomfort, that later become the sharpest echoes in memory. When the morning came, it found them packing the tent with ease, joking about the bugs and the cold dew, snapping one last photograph to mark the start of a new day. They set off down the winding roads again, their energy renewed, their spirits untamed. But somewhere along the asphalt that stretched endlessly before them, the first invisible threads of mystery began to coil around their journey. There was a sense of expectation in the air, an unspoken prelude to absence, the kind of feeling that one might dismiss at the time but that history remembers vividly. By the time they were last seen, they were still laughing, still alive, still wrapped in the invincible cloak of youth that makes people believe they can outrun time, danger, and consequence. And yet, in the stories told years later, in the fragments of witness accounts and the anxious retellings of family and friends, those moments shimmer with a tragic poignancy. The world watched them disappear into the open road, and in that disappearance, it began to sense the emptiness that would haunt every photograph, every memory, and every unspoken question for decades to come. In those final hours, there was no hint of the darkness that would eventually shadow their journey. Only the sunlight, the laughter, the promise of adventure, and the fragile beauty of two lives intertwined, heading somewhere unknown, leaving behind a world that would spend years trying to catch up to them. The moment their car failed to return, the world they left behind began to unravel quietly, like a thread pulled from a delicate tapestry. Their families, at first assuming a simple delay or detour, quickly felt the pang of unease settle deep in their bones. Calls went unanswered, letters left unopened, and the normalcy of a summer afternoon transformed into a tense vigil. Every ring of the phone made hearts leap, only to fall again when it remained silent. Sleep became a stranger. Meals were eaten mechanically, conversations stuttered with anxious gaps, and the weight of not knowing pressed down on every thought. It was in these early hours that fear started to take form, not the fear of the unknown, but the fear of the known impossibility that they might never come home. Friends of the missing pair tried to piece together the last traces of their journey. Each memory shared in fragmented whispers around kitchens, classrooms, and coffee tables felt like a lifeline, yet each one also highlighted the fragility of hope. One friend remembered a laugh shared over a gas station soda, another recalled the way one had squinted at a map, pretending to know the route better than they did. Small details, at the time insignificant, now seemed imbued with meaning, as if the universe had hidden a secret in the mundane that only hindsight could reveal. Every recollection was both comforting and cruel, a reminder of what had been, and what was now impossibly absent. The local police opened a case, and the investigation began slowly, weighed down by bureaucratic processes and limited evidence. Officers retraced their intended route, checking motels, rest stops, and roadside diners. Their efforts, though diligent, were like tossing pebbles into an endless void. Each lead seemed promising, but dissolved into dead ends. The lack of concrete evidence was maddening, and the officers' polite reassurances to the families, "We are doing everything we can," offered little relief. Every unmarked turn, every abandoned stretch of highway, became a silent witness to the friends' disappearance, yet none offered answers. Media coverage, though initially sparse, began to grow as the days turned into weeks. Local newspapers printed small columns, photographs of smiling faces frozen in youthful joy, accompanied by the desperate plea, "Have you seen them?" News anchors repeated the story in brief segments, each iteration a haunting echo of absence. The coverage brought strangers into the fold of worry. People who had never met the friends felt compelled to check familiar roads, to look for signs of life where none existed. But the exposure was double-edged. It reminded families that the world was watching, yet no one could fill the empty spaces left behind, no one could bring their loved ones back. As the search expanded, volunteers joined in, combing wooded areas, abandoned cabins, and riversides. Footprints were followed, shadows scrutinized, and every discarded item catalogued. There were false hopes, brief glimpses of someone matching their description, reports of a hitchhiker resembling one of them, but each lead dissipated like smoke. With every unfulfilled possibility, hope eroded just a little more, replaced by an anxious, creeping dread. The community's collective heartbeat seemed to slow, weighted by uncertainty, as the days stretched into a liminal space where time itself felt uncertain. Amidst the practical measures, the search parties, the police interviews, the missing persons posters, there was the unquantifiable emotional toll. Families began to fracture under the strain of constant worry. One parent retreated into silence, unable to confront the possibility that their child might be gone forever. Siblings oscillated between anger and despair, questioning decisions made and roads taken. Friends wrestled with survivor's guilt, wondering if some overlooked word or gesture could have prevented this calamity. The emotional gravity of not knowing, of imagining every worst-case scenario, became a quiet, omnipresent companion, shaping every waking moment. Witnesses, when they came forward, added fragments to a puzzle no one could yet solve. A gas station attendant recalled their voices but could not remember faces clearly. A passing trucker thought he saw the car on a lonely stretch of road but wasn't sure of the day. Each account offered tantalizing possibilities yet ultimately left more questions than answers. The gaps between recollection and certainty widened, and in that space, fear metastasized. It was a psychological landscape of uncertainty, where imagination became both a curse and a coping mechanism. Days turned into weeks, and the search efforts began to feel Sisyphean. Maps were studied obsessively, timelines reconstructed in painstaking detail. Investigators revisited each reported sighting, re-interviewed witnesses, and examined every conceivable angle. Every minor detail, a misplaced jacket, a forgotten receipt, a photograph taken at a roadside diner, was scrutinized for significance. And yet, despite the meticulous work, the truth remained elusive. The roads the friends had traveled seemed ordinary, yet they had swallowed the pair whole, leaving only the eerie silence of absence behind. Through it all, the families clung to the smallest threads of hope. The mere possibility that the friends were alive, that they might appear at any moment, kept their hearts tethered to the world. But hope was fragile, and with each day that passed without answers, that tether frayed. The weight of waiting became almost unbearable, each night a mirror of the previous, darkness, silence, and a gnawing sense of loss. The story of these missing friends began to grow beyond the personal. It became a cautionary tale whispered among neighbors, shared over dinner tables, recounted on local radio shows. People speculated about what could have happened: accident, foul play, or something unexplainable. Each theory carried its own emotional resonance, feeding the anxiety of those closest to the case, while outsiders could only marvel at the mystery. Yet even as rumors swirled and theories multiplied, the truth remained stubbornly out of reach, a distant horizon that promised nothing but questions. In the midst of all this chaos and despair, the world waited. The friend's disappearance became a haunting echo in everyday life: an empty chair at a family table, a voicemail never returned, a backpack gathering dust. Time moved forward, but their absence remained suspended, a ghostly constant. Every photograph, every memory, every whispered story became sacred, reminders that even in the fullness of life, loss could intrude suddenly and irrevocably. The search for answers continued, but the emotional journey, the anxiety, the hope, the grief, had already begun, etching itself into the hearts of everyone who loved them and setting the stage for revelations that, decades later, would come from an unexpected and forgotten source. The investigation into their disappearance began in earnest, but from the start, it was a journey into shadows and half-truths. Police retraced the route the friends had planned, following highways that stretched like ribbons through dense forests and empty fields. Motels were checked, often yielding only the echo of footsteps or the faint scent of long-gone travelers. Rest stops revealed little beyond empty coffee cups and worn maps discarded by other wanderers. Every lead seemed promising at first: a sighting by a passing trucker, a motel clerk who thought he remembered seeing the two friends, but each fragment dissolved into nothing, leaving investigators and families alike grasping at air. The roads themselves seemed complicit, ordinary and familiar, yet cruelly unyielding in the secrets they held. Witnesses became both a lifeline and a source of frustration. One local gas station attendant recalled hearing laughter the night the friends stopped briefly, the echoes of joy as vivid in memory as it had been that evening. Another traveler thought he had seen the car parked by a quiet trailhead, but couldn't be sure if it had been the right day. Each account painted a partial picture, but the inconsistencies gnawed at the edges of hope. What should have been straightforward, a pair of teenagers on a road trip, was turning into a puzzle with missing pieces. Investigators compiled timelines, retraced routes, and mapped out possibilities, yet the deeper they dug, the more labyrinthine the story became. Among the empty highways and desolate rest stops, small traces of their presence began to emerge. A forgotten jacket by the side of the road, a crumpled receipt from a diner far off the planned route, a single photograph of them in front of a lake that didn't match any map. Each clue seemed insignificant alone, yet together, they whispered a narrative that was disjointed and haunting. It was as though the landscape itself had swallowed them and left only cryptic breadcrumbs behind. Every detail was examined with painstaking care: the way the sun fell in photographs, the direction of tire tracks, the peculiar bend of a roadside sign. Investigators and amateur sleuths alike felt the tension of chasing shadows, every observation teetering between revelation and dead end. As the investigation unfolded, the emotional toll on families deepened. Nights were filled with pacing and sleepless anxiety, days with relentless questioning and endless phone calls. Parents clung to every lead, every scrap of information, as if it could restore a normal life that now felt impossibly fractured. Siblings, friends, and cousins each carried a private anguish, watching the passage of time erode hope while trying to maintain courage in the presence of others. It was a psychological crucible, a slow-burning fire of fear and frustration, as the families became entangled in a mystery that seemed deliberately elusive. Some clues offered tantalizing glimpses of the journey they had undertaken. A gas station clerk remembered them joking about a shortcut that neither had mapped. A park ranger recalled seeing two young travelers photographing a waterfall, unaware that these seemingly innocuous moments were now the final traces of their carefree lives. Each memory held a dual weight: the joy of youth and the unbearable poignancy of absence. The small, mundane details, the laughter, the gestures, the shared smiles, were now magnified in the minds of those who loved them, creating a mosaic of both longing and dread. Investigators also had to contend with the limitations of technology at the time. The mid-1990s had no ubiquitous cell phones, no GPS tracking, and surveillance cameras were rare in rural areas. Every lead required legwork, intuition, and often, the painstaking reconstruction of fragmented witness accounts. Every misremembered detail could mislead, every forgotten name or number could close a path to understanding. The uncertainty compounded, stretching the emotional endurance of all involved. The search was exhaustive but invisible, a slow-moving machine against the vast backdrop of an indifferent landscape. Despite the frustration and dead ends, moments of hope flickered intermittently. A neighbor reported seeing a familiar car on a distant highway. A child in a nearby town claimed to have waved to two strangers by a gas station. Each hint sent waves of cautious optimism through the families, only to crash against reality when confirmation could not be found. Hope and despair intertwined, forming an emotional rhythm that defined the early months of the search. It was a liminal space, suspended between what had been and what could never fully be known. As the investigation pressed on, the psychological atmosphere grew heavy, a pervasive tension that seemed to touch every corner of the town and beyond. The roads that had once symbolized freedom now appeared ominous, stretching endlessly with the possibility of danger hidden behind every bend. Every abandoned campsite, every empty picnic area, every overlooked trail became a theater of speculation. Could they have been kidnapped? Had an accident occurred in a remote area? Or were the friends caught up in something completely unimaginable? Each scenario played in the minds of families and investigators alike, none satisfying the craving for closure. Yet even in the shadow of uncertainty, the friendship that had sent them on that fateful journey became a touchstone for memory. Those who knew them spoke not only of fear but of laughter, courage, and an irrepressible spirit. It was in these recollections, some funny, some tender, that the friends' presence persisted, hauntingly real even in absence. Photographs, personal letters, and scattered mementos became sacred objects, portals to a life that the world had temporarily lost, and a reminder that every lost day was a day weighed with anxiety and hope. By the end of this period of searching and speculation, the story had grown more than a simple missing persons case. It became a narrative of suspense, a psychological maze, and a deeply human experience of longing and dread. The fragments of clues hinted at a journey interrupted, a life suspended between the ordinary and the extraordinary. And within these fragments, the first whispers of the truth lay hidden, waiting silently for someone to notice, for someone to see the connections that had eluded so many. The road trip, once filled with laughter and endless possibility, had begun to take on the contours of a haunting mystery, a story that would slowly reveal itself in ways no one could yet imagine. It was months after their disappearance that the first tangible lead surfaced, almost by accident, in the form of a small, forgotten object. A disposable camera, dusty and abandoned in the corner of a motel room, had escaped notice amidst the flurry of investigations, media coverage, and the relentless search. It was an ordinary thing in every sense, a plastic rectangle filled with unprocessed film, carrying within it the ordinary moments of two young friends on what was supposed to be a joyful journey. And yet, in that small object lay the potential to unravel the mystery, to give voice to those silenced days, to illuminate the path that had vanished into shadows. The discovery itself was mundane at first. Housekeepers or staff going through old rooms had merely picked up the camera, assuming it would be disposed of or returned to lost and found. Its weight in the hand, unremarkable. The lens, scratched and clouded with age, seemed to hide its significance. It was only when someone, perhaps a family member, perhaps a diligent investigator, noticed the date scribbled on the film roll, that the room seemed to pulse with quiet anticipation. 1996, the year they had disappeared. For the first time in months, the world held in its hands a possibility, a direct link to the friends' journey, frozen in time, waiting to be revealed. There was an almost reverent tension as the camera changed hands. No one spoke much, because to speak aloud was to risk shattering the fragile hope that the film might contain answers. Each person involved felt the gravity of what was in front of them, hundreds of moments of light-hearted adventure, curiosity, and camaraderie, hidden behind a simple lens, waiting for someone to bring them into the light. The very ordinariness of the camera amplified its power. It was a vessel carrying both memory and mystery, laughter and the quiet undertow of tragedy that would eventually define the story. The decision to develop the film was taken slowly, almost ceremoniously. There was an awareness that every photograph, every frame, could hold the key to understanding, or the cruel reminder of absence. Those handling the camera imagined the friends as they had been on the journey, carefree, laughing, unaware of the way fate had begun to twist their lives. With each turn of the hand, each careful placement into a developing envelope, there was a sense of stepping into another world, a space both intimate and unknowable. The anticipation built as slowly as a tide, a quiet rhythm of hope and fear crashing together. Even before the images emerged, the emotional atmosphere had shifted. Families and investigators were caught between cautious optimism and the gnawing dread that whatever was captured might reveal something unbearable. The camera, once overlooked, had become a talisman of truth, a reminder that even the smallest, most mundane objects could carry extraordinary weight. It was almost as if the friends themselves had left a final message, trusting that someone, someday, would see what they had left behind and finally understand. The first photograph, when it appeared, was a revelation in its simplest form. Two figures smiling at the camera, arms draped over each other, standing against a backdrop of rolling hills and late afternoon sunlight. The image was both joyful and heart-wrenching, a snapshot of a moment now impossibly distant. It was a reminder that these had been real people, full of laughter and plans, now suspended in a liminal space between memory and absence. Each subsequent photograph revealed more of the journey: the small motels, roadside diners, the winding highways, the riverside campsites. There was nothing overtly alarming in these images, yet the ordinariness became almost unbearable, a stark contrast to the fact that the friends would never be seen alive again. As the film developed, subtle details began to emerge that no one had noticed before. Shadows in the background, unfamiliar figures at the edges of photographs, landscapes that seemed slightly out of place. Nothing overt, nothing dramatic, yet enough to unsettle, to hint at something lurking beneath the surface of a simple road trip. Each frame carried dual meaning, a record of joy and a silent, creeping tension that suggested events beyond anyone's perception at the time. Emotionally, this was the beginning of the transformation from hope to mystery, a slow realization that the camera had captured more than just smiles and scenery. The camera itself became a character in the story, a silent witness to the moments it had captured. Its presence reminded those who handled it of the fragility of memory, of the impermanence of life, and of the delicate balance between ordinary existence and extraordinary tragedy. It was a symbol of possibility, a conduit through which the friends could speak long after their disappearance. And yet, there was a lingering dread in knowing that within those photographs, the truth waited patiently, sometimes cruel, sometimes illuminating, always inescapable. By the time the last frames were prepared for viewing, the world around the camera seemed to shrink. Families gathered, investigators leaned in, and even casual observers felt a quiet tension, as if the room itself recognized the weight of what was about to be seen. No one knew what to expect: revelation, closure, horror, or more questions. And in that uncertainty lay the true power of the forgotten camera, a reminder that time could conceal, but could not destroy, the evidence of life, of presence, and of the final, unspoken truths that lay waiting to be discovered. The forgotten camera, once an overlooked object, had now become the linchpin of the entire mystery. It was proof that even amidst the chaos of disappearance, amidst the frustration of unanswered questions, the smallest things could carry the greatest significance. Every detail, every frame, was a thread, waiting to be woven into a narrative that would finally, painstakingly, reveal what had really happened on that summer road trip in 1996. And for those who held it, the camera was both a beacon and a warning, that the story was far from over, and that the truth, once illuminated, could never be unseen. The moment had finally arrived. The small, unassuming camera, once forgotten in the corner of a motel room, now lay in the hands of those who could unlock its secrets. The anticipation was electric, almost suffocating, as the film was carefully extracted from its plastic casing. The scent of aged chemicals and plastic mingled with the tense air, a tangible reminder that what they held could alter everything they thought they knew. Every click of the developing machine, every faint whir of machinery in the darkroom, echoed with the gravity of expectation. It was as if the camera itself had been holding its breath for 20 years, waiting for the moment when its silent testimony would finally be heard. The first image emerged slowly, almost reluctantly. Under the dim, focused light of the developing tray, a familiar landscape took shape. A roadside, stretched out under a summer sky, the two friends standing side by side, smiles wide, unaware of the shadow of absence that would one day claim them. The image was simple, ordinary almost, yet the weight it carried was extraordinary. There was joy frozen mid-breath, laughter captured in stillness, a moment that would never return but would speak volumes decades later. It was proof that they had lived fully in those days, that they had been real in the world, and that the camera had preserved every fleeting nuance. As each subsequent frame materialized, the narrative of the road trip unfolded in a series of delicate, haunting snapshots. Pictures of highways winding endlessly through forests, roadside diners with flickering neon signs, motels with peeling paint and creaking doors. Every image was imbued with the friends' personalities, carefree, curious, alive. But beneath the surface, a subtle tension began to emerge. There were glimpses of shadows where no one should have been, angles that seemed slightly off, and figures in the background that appeared too deliberate to be accidental. It was a quiet, almost imperceptible unease, one that grew with each frame, suggesting that these moments, though joyful, were not entirely without consequence. The tactile experience of the developing process heightened the suspense. Fingers brushed gently across the wet surfaces, careful not to smudge the images, to preserve every tiny detail. The room was silent except for the occasional murmur of awe or apprehension. Each photograph was a revelation, a window into a past long sealed, a bridge between memory and truth. There was a ritualistic quality to the act, a slow unfolding of a story that had been hidden in plain sight. Every photo, every shadow, every smile was a clue, a piece of a puzzle that demanded patience, attention, and emotional resilience. It was in the ordinary details that the extraordinary often hid. One photograph showed them laughing on a small bridge over a river, the sunlight glinting off the water. At first glance, it was pure joy. But upon closer inspection, there was a figure in the far background, half hidden behind a tree, whose presence felt deliberate, almost intrusive. Another image captured them in front of a roadside attraction, but the angle of the photograph seemed skewed, suggesting movement or a perspective that didn't align with the scene. These anomalies, subtle yet undeniable, became the first threads of mystery, the first whispers of a story that was far more complex than a simple disappearance. Emotionally, the process was a roller coaster. Families and investigators felt hope and dread entwined, alternating with every new image. The joy of seeing the friends alive and vibrant was tempered by the growing realization that these images might hold clues to darker truths. Every photograph demanded interpretation, speculation, and emotional reckoning. For those who loved the missing friends, it was almost unbearable, joy and sorrow intertwined in a delicate, suffocating dance. Each frame was a gift and a burden simultaneously, capturing both life and the lingering questions that had haunted everyone for decades. The narrative hidden within the film slowly began to take shape. There were photos of quiet moments, them sharing a meal at a roadside diner, gazing at a sunset, setting up a tent beside a river. These images painted the journey as intimate, personal, and fleetingly innocent. But there were also signs of dissonance, roads that didn't match maps, turns that seemed unexplained, and the occasional shadow or figure that suggested they were not entirely alone. It was a delicate tension, the perfect balance between memory and mystery, one that pulled viewers into the story, urging them to search for meaning in every frame. The act of examining the photographs became almost ritualistic. Investigators pored over the images with magnifying glasses, families traced familiar features with trembling fingers, and each detail was catalogued and cross-referenced with the sparse witness accounts. Tiny inconsistencies became the foundation for speculation. A crooked sign in one frame led to the discovery of an abandoned side road. A reflection in a diner window suggested the presence of a vehicle not accounted for in any known timeline. These small details, almost imperceptible to a casual observer, were the breadcrumbs that would eventually guide the world closer to understanding. With each new photograph, the emotional intensity deepened. Joy, nostalgia, fear, and grief merged into a single, overwhelming experience. The friends, captured in moments of laughter and wonder, seemed to exist simultaneously in life and absence, past and present. The camera had not only preserved images but had preserved essence, the intangible qualities that made these two young people real and unforgettable. And yet, beneath the surface of happiness, the subtle hints of something darker grew more pronounced, a reminder that life's ordinary moments can conceal extraordinary mysteries. By the end of the developing process, the film had transformed into more than just a record of a road trip. It had become a testament, a silent witness to the joys, uncertainties, and eventual tragedy that had defined the journey. Each photograph was a narrative, each frame a chapter, and the collection as a whole told a story that no single voice could convey. The friends, once missing and intangible, were now present in a new form, captured forever in stillness, yet speaking with profound clarity about their lives, their journey, and the shadow of events that awaited discovery. And in that silence, in the delicate hum of anticipation as the last image dried, there was a palpable understanding. The camera had revealed more than moments, it had revealed potential truths, mysteries, and connections that had eluded investigators for decades. What had once been a story defined by absence and anxiety was now poised to become a story defined by revelation, one frame at a time. The film, once forgotten, had awakened, and with it, the journey toward truth had truly begun. The photographs, once scattered moments of joy and youth, now began to whisper a different language, one of patterns, alignments, and hidden meanings. At first, the images felt like random fragments of a trip, a diner here, a gas station there, a stretch of highway vanishing into the horizon. But when pinned to the investigation board side by side, when each was studied with obsessive patience, a sequence began to emerge. What once looked like coincidence began to resemble choreography, as though their journey had been guided not by freedom, but by something, or someone, trailing just out of view. The first pattern revealed itself in the landscapes. In nearly every frame, no matter how ordinary the subject, there was a sliver of something else lingering in the background, a car's headlight glinting through trees, a reflection of movement in a window, a figure blurred by distance. Alone, these details could be dismissed as accidents of photography. Together, they hinted at consistency. It was as though an invisible presence had been orbiting their every move, capturing itself unintentionally in the margins of their memories. The more the images were studied, the more these fragments stitched into a chilling design. They were not as alone on the road as they had believed. One photograph, in particular, carried the weight of revelation. It showed the two friends sitting at a picnic table outside a faded rest stop. They were smiling, leaning close to the camera, radiating the simple joy of a summer afternoon. But in the distant parking lot, half-shadowed, sat the outline of a sedan. Its shape, blurred yet unmistakable, appeared again in later images. A diner parking lot, a motel 2 towns away, even in the reflection of a convenience store's glass door. Always in the background, always at a distance. The car, or perhaps the person within it, became the thread that tied the mystery together. As investigators mapped the photos against geography, another pattern emerged. The friends' route, thought to be spontaneous, seemed oddly predictable in retrospect. Their chosen stops formed a triangle across the map, 3 points that intersected highways, small towns, and empty stretches of rural roads. The camera revealed not just where they had been, but where they had been guided, consciously or unconsciously. It was less like a trip of exploration and more like a path drawn for them, one that circled back on itself in unsettling repetition. The photographs also exposed a shift in their expressions over time. In the early frames, their smiles were wide, carefree, untouched by worry. But as the film progressed, subtle cracks appeared. A smile that seemed too forced, eyes glancing off camera as though distracted, a slight tension in posture. These were details easily overlooked by casual eyes, but under the scrutiny of those desperate for answers, they became evidence of awareness, signs that perhaps the two friends had sensed something, someone, encroaching on their freedom. Emotionally, this discovery deepened the wound for their families. The images, once cherished as remnants of happy days, now became mirrors of fear. Parents and siblings looked into those captured faces and saw not just joy but the silent intrusion of danger. The realization that the friends may have known, may have felt the shadow before it consumed them, transformed the photographs into a haunting testimony. It was no longer just about where they had gone, but about the growing unease that had followed them step by step. Even the order of the photos suggested intentionality. The friends often swapped positions in the frame, sometimes one holding the camera, sometimes the other. Yet, in several late-stage photographs, the angles no longer matched the casual style of their earlier shots. They appeared taken from lower angles, or from slightly farther distances, as if a third presence had been behind the lens. Whether intentional or accidental, the effect was chilling. If they hadn't taken those pictures themselves, then who had? As investigators pieced together these anomalies, a new question arose. Had the camera itself become a tool not just of memory, but of surveillance? Had the unknown figure, the shadow trailing behind them, contributed to the role of film? The possibility was as terrifying as it was tantalizing. The forgotten camera, once thought to be an innocent time capsule, may have contained not just their story but the fingerprints of the very presence that had swallowed them. The hidden patterns also began to intersect with time. By analyzing the angle of shadows, the positioning of the sun, and even the state of the landscapes, the budding of trees, the dryness of grass, investigators traced the photos to specific days and hours. This timeline, cross-checked against witness statements and credit card records, began to reveal discrepancies. There were gaps, hours, even whole days, that the photos seemed to skip over, holes in the story where something unspoken must have occurred. These gaps became black boxes in the narrative, stretches of silence where the shadows might have moved closer. For the audience of the unfolding story, the effect was hypnotic. The photographs were no longer static. They pulsed with meaning, demanded attention, and whispered of stories locked between the borders of the frame. Every pixel became suspect, every shadow a question. The film had shifted from memory to map, from sentimental artifact to coded testimony. And so, the friends' road trip, once thought to be a simple journey of youth and adventure, transformed into something else entirely. The film revealed not just their laughter, not just their presence in 1996, but the encroaching design of something darker. Whether it was chance, fate, or the careful orchestration of a predator, the patterns were undeniable. The story was no longer random, it was deliberate, structured, hidden in plain sight. What began as fragments of joy had become a mosaic of forewarning. The photographs whispered the same unsettling truth: they were never traveling alone. The revelation came not as a loud thunderclap, but as a quiet shiver running beneath the surface, subtle at first, almost easy to dismiss, until it grew into something undeniable. After weeks of studying the developed photographs, investigators and family members found themselves returning again and again to one specific image. It was taken at twilight, the fading orange glow of the sky smeared across the horizon like a bruise. The two friends were standing beside their car, one leaning casually against the hood, the other holding a paper cup, laughing mid-sentence. On the surface, it was warm and ordinary, even beautiful in its simplicity. But it was not the friends who drew the eye. It was the reflection. On the driver's side window, faint but unmistakable, was the blurred outline of another figure. A human shape, too tall to be either of the friends, too distorted to be dismissed as a trick of light. The figure appeared to be standing just outside the frame, as if lingering behind the camera, half caught in glass. Once noticed, it was impossible to ignore. The laughter on the girls' faces suddenly looked different, tinged with unease, their postures slightly guarded, as though they too sensed what the camera had unknowingly captured. That single reflection changed everything. For the families, it was devastating, a silent intruder preserved forever in the very image meant to capture joy. For the investigators, it was fuel, a physical trace that hinted at presence, intention, and possibly pursuit. The photo was enlarged, enhanced, studied under every form of modern technology available. But no matter how much it was examined, the reflection remained stubbornly ambiguous, a silhouette with no face, a body with no features. It was at once proof and void, a confirmation of intrusion but a refusal to identify who, or what, that intrusion truly was. Other photographs began to echo this unsettling discovery. In a snapshot outside a diner, the friends posed with milkshakes, unaware that through the dusty window behind them, the blurred outline of what seemed like the same figure was visible once more. In another frame, taken at a gas station, the shape appeared again, this time reflected in the rearview mirror of their car. Always at a distance, always distorted, but always present. The more these images were studied, the clearer the pattern became. The shadow had been with them longer than anyone had realized, orbiting their every step like a silent predator. The emotional toll of these revelations was immeasurable. Parents who had once clung to photographs as proof of their children's joy now saw them as warnings overlooked, cries for help they had never heard. What once inspired nostalgia now conjured dread. The images no longer comforted, they accused. They demanded the living to confront what had been hiding in plain sight all along. The discovery deepened the grief, adding a layer of horror to the loss. For the siblings, it was unbearable to know their sisters or daughters might have known fear in those final days, their joy laced with the quiet awareness of being followed. For the investigators, however, the reflection was a spark. It opened the possibility that the disappearance was not an accident, not a simple case of two young women vanishing into the wilderness of time. The shadow in the glass suggested pursuit, surveillance, and possibly premeditation. Suddenly, theories that had once seemed too dark, too elaborate, became plausible. The forgotten film was no longer just evidence of where they had been, it was evidence of who had been there with them. The narrative of the case shifted dramatically. What had once been thought of as a story of youthful misadventure became a story of intrusion, of lives intersecting with darkness. The reflection was a wound in time, a tiny crack through which something sinister seeped into their final days. It was enough to make investigators revisit long-cold witness statements, re-examine gas station receipts, and redraw timelines. It raised the haunting question, had there been someone following them for miles, days, perhaps the entire trip? And if so, why? Cinematically, the reflection acted as the hinge of the story. Before it, the photographs were seen as sentimental artifacts. After it, they became testimony, documents of pursuit, evidence of a shadow that had waited, watched, and perhaps acted in silence. The tension of the story thickened, every frame suddenly vibrating with dread. What else might be hidden in the margins, waiting to be uncovered? The emotional atmosphere of this discovery was suffocating. Those who studied the photographs felt themselves haunted, as though the shadow in the glass was not confined to the past but reached across decades to observe them now. The facelessness of the figure gave it power. It could be anyone, everyone, or no one. The ambiguity became its own form of terror, forcing all who looked into the photo to wrestle with their own fears of the unknown. In the end, this single detail, the blurred silhouette caught by accident, transformed the investigation. It was no longer about two friends vanishing into thin air. It was about presence, about the silent witness who may have been more than a witness at all. It was about a camera film that not only preserved memories but had, perhaps unintentionally, documented the intrusion of something unspeakable. The photograph was placed at the center of the board, surrounded by pins and strings, the axis of everything that followed. For the first time, the story had a face, or rather, the haunting absence of one. The reflection in the photograph had cracked open the silence of the past, but it also left behind an echo, a haunting sense that more was waiting, hidden beneath the surface of the film roll. Investigators and family members began to approach the photographs not as relics but as crime scenes, dissecting every inch with magnifying glasses, light boards, and forensic software. What emerged was not a clear narrative but something far more unsettling, layers of meaning, fragments that seemed to align in ways too strange to ignore. One of the most striking discoveries came from a seemingly unremarkable photograph taken outside a roadside motel. At first glance, it was simple, the two friends leaning against their car, arms draped around one another's shoulders, smiling as though exhaustion had softened into laughter. But on closer inspection, details began to rise. In the upper corner of the frame, through the second-story window of the motel, a figure seemed to be watching. It was blurry, more suggestion than certainty, but the tilt of the head and the placement of the shoulders suggested intent, as if someone had been standing there, observing them at the very moment the shutter clicked. Was it another guest? A trick of the light? Or was it the same faceless figure whose outline had haunted the reflection in the car window? The investigators couldn't let it go. They tracked the motel, now long abandoned, its rooms stripped of furniture and its walls peeling with mold. Yet standing in those same rooms, they reported an eerie alignment. The window's vantage point perfectly matched the angle of the mysterious blur. It was as if the camera had frozen not just memory, but surveillance itself, catching the watcher in the act of watching. As more images were re-examined, the sense of choreography grew. In one frame, the friends were captured walking along a dusty road, the late afternoon sun stretching their shadows across the gravel. Yet faintly, behind them, there appeared to be a third shadow. Longer, thinner, less defined, but positioned perfectly between their outlines. No one remembered a third traveler. The suggestion alone was enough to chill the air in the investigation room. Theories began to form like storm clouds. Some believed the figure was a stranger, someone who had followed the girls with predatory patience, waiting for a chance to act. Others believed it could have been someone they met on the road, perhaps a friendly acquaintance whose presence later soured. But there were those who took it even further, whispering about a presence that didn't belong to flesh and blood at all, something spectral, something woven into the fabric of coincidence and fate. After all, wasn't it strange how the figure never appeared in clarity, always blurred, always peripheral, as though belonging more to suggestion than reality? Emotionally, the weight of these interpretations was unbearable. The families, caught between hope and despair, began to argue over the meaning of the photographs. One mother insisted that the shadow was proof that someone had taken her daughter. Another, exhausted by decades of grief, begged for it not to be true, for the figure to be nothing more than a trick of time, a smudge of memory. The photographs became battlegrounds of emotion, each person projecting their deepest fears and desires onto the blurred outlines of strangers. For investigators, however, the blurred figure became the cornerstone of renewed focus. They began to cross-reference the photos with police reports from 1996, noting sightings of unfamiliar vehicles, lone travelers, and suspicious activity along the same highways. One detail stood out: multiple reports of a pale sedan trailing behind travelers during that summer, a car that matched the vague outlines captured again and again in the photographs. Could it be coincidence? Or had the camera preserved not just moments, but the presence of a predator weaving through the same roads? The unsettling part was how deliberate it began to feel. The photographs no longer seemed random or casual. Each one, when studied in sequence, gave the impression of a story unfolding in silence. The girls laughing, the shadow growing nearer, the car appearing more frequently, the angle shifting from self-portraits to something less voluntary. It was a slow tightening, a narrative within the narrative, as though the roll of film had unintentionally documented the quiet closing of a trap. Cinematically, the tension at this point was unbearable. The still images, though frozen, seemed to vibrate with life and dread, demanding the viewer to fill in the silence with their own imagination. What happened after the final frame? Did the shadow step fully into the light? Did the friend sense it, fear it, or dismiss it until it was too late? The haunting realization was this: the camera had been more honest than memory. Memory fades, reshapes itself, clings to comfort. But film, though imperfect, preserves. And what it preserved here was not only the joy of friendship but the undeniable suggestion of surveillance, intrusion, and inevitability. By the time the last photograph was placed back onto the board, the room felt heavier. The air seemed charged, the silence oppressive. Everyone there knew what they had seen. The patterns were no longer whispers, they were declarations. Whether predator, stranger, or something more intangible, the two friends had not been alone. And in that knowledge, the story deepened into something darker. It was no longer just about disappearance. It was about pursuit. About the way the past leaves fingerprints, even in forgotten film. About the terrifying truth that sometimes, what we miss in the